They told him no human had ever walked out of the Empress's chamber alive, and yet the door still opened for him. The corridor outside was silent, too clean, like the palace itself refused to acknowledge what happened behind that sealed alloy door, and Daniel Hayes stood there in the center of it, wrists unbound but future already decided. The faint hum of alien machinery vibrating through the polished floor beneath his boots as two guards flanked him without touching him, as if even they knew. Proximity meant nothing when fate had already been signed. He kept his eyes forward, steady, measuring distance, temperature, exits, old habits from a life that used to involve saving people, not being offered up as part of an agreement no one bothered to explain in full, and somewhere high above, hidden in layers of living architecture, bioluminescent veins pulsed with a soft violet glow, casting shifting shadows that moved like breath across the walls. The air smelled faintly metallic, warm. Despite the wide corridors, like the building itself was alive and watching, and Daniel exhaled slowly, controlled, counting the seconds the way he used to when entering unstable structures, except this time there was no collapse to predict, no fire to outrun, just a night waiting for him at the end of the hall. "Stop," one of the guards said, voice filtered through a translator that flattened emotion into something mechanical, and the massive doors ahead parted without a sound, revealing a chamber so vast it swallowed the light, a room designed not for comfort but for presence, for something that needed space to exist without constraint. He stepped inside, boots echoing once before the door sealed behind him with a final, quiet click that felt heavier than any lock, and for a moment there was nothing, just dim light, soft pulses of color along the walls, and the faint rise and fall of distant systems regulating atmosphere. Then she moved. Empress Lyra Vera did not announce herself, did not need to, her form emerging from the far side of the chamber as if the light itself parted to make room for her, tall, composed, her skin carrying a subtle iridescent sheen that shifted between deep crimson and something darker when she turned, her eyes fixed on him with a focus that was not curiosity but assessment, like he was a variable in an equation she had already solved. Daniel didn't bow, didn't step back, just stood there, shoulders squared, breathing steady, because fear had never helped anyone survive, and if this night was meant to break him, he wasn't going to help it along. The temperature ticked up. He felt it in the air first, then on his skin, a gradual rise like standing too close to a heating vent, and somewhere in the room a soft tone chimed, barely audible, but enough to make him glance at the nearest panel where alien script flickered alongside a number climbing past what his instincts told him was safe. She noticed the glance, her head tilting slightly, and for the first time her voice cut through the quiet, low, controlled, carrying weight without effort. "You observe your surroundings carefully for someone who has no control over them," and Daniel let out a small breath, almost a laugh but not quite, because humor had always been his way of pushing back against things bigger than him. "Old habit," he said, voice calm, American accent unmistakable in the sterile air, "helps me stay alive," and something in her expression shifted, not softer, not kinder, just different, like she had expected defiance in a different form. Another chime sounded, sharper this time, the light along the walls intensifying in response, and Daniel felt the heat rise another degree, subtle but undeniable, like the room itself was building towards something, and he realized then that this wasn't just a chamber, it was a system, a controlled environment designed for a purpose he hadn't been fully told. Lyra took a step closer, each movement precise, measured, and when she stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the faint patterns beneath her skin, she studied him again, longer this time, and asked, almost as if testing the words, "Do humans always face the inevitable with this level of composure?" And Daniel met her gaze without flinching, because whatever this night was supposed to be, whatever role he had been assigned in it, he wasn't going to play it the way they expected. "No," he said quietly, "just the ones who've got nothing left to lose," and for a fraction of a second, in the shifting light of a room that felt more alive by the second, the Empress didn't look like a ruler preparing to break a man, she looked like someone trying to understand why he wasn't already broken. The heat did not spike all at once, it crept in like a slow tide, measured and deliberate, rising degree by degree until Daniel could feel it pressing against his skin through the fabric of his shirt, and the panel on the wall continued its quiet climb past numbers that no longer felt theoretical. He shifted his weight slightly, not retreating, just adjusting, the way he had learned to do in unstable environments where panic only made things worse, and across from him Lyra Vera remained still. But not unaffected, her breathing no longer perfectly even, her shoulders lifting just a fraction higher with each inhale as if the air itself was becoming heavier. Another soft chime echoed through the chamber, followed by a low vibration that traveled through the floor and up into his boots, and Daniel's eyes flicked once more toward the nearest display, catching the pattern this time, the rhythm of the alerts, not random but cyclical, like a system reaching a threshold it was designed to monitor but not necessarily stop. "This room is regulating you," he said quietly, more to confirm than to ask, and for the first time her gaze sharpened in a way that acknowledged he was not just observing, he was understanding. "It is maintaining balance," she replied, though the precision in her voice had begun to thin at the edges, like something beneath it was starting to push through, and Daniel nodded once, slow, taking that in, mapping the situation the way he always did, inputs and outputs, cause and effect, except this time the system was not a machine, it was her. The temperature rose again, subtle but undeniable, and a faint shimmer of light traced along the patterns beneath her skin, brighter now, more pronounced, like circuitry activating in response to a demand it could not fully meet, and Daniel felt a flicker of concern cut through his steady focus, not for himself, but for the instability building in front of him. "That is not balance," he said, his voice still calm but firmer now, "that is escalation," and she exhaled slowly, the sound almost unintentional, as if control over even that small action was becoming less certain. "You speak as if you have seen this before," she said, though the question carried less authority than before. More curiosity edged with something unfamiliar, and Daniel gave a small shake of his head. "Not this," he admitted, "but systems fail the same way everywhere, they try to compensate until they cannot anymore," and the lights responded again, brighter, warmer, the chamber subtly shifting its environment as if to prove his point. Lyra took a step back this time, not away from him, but as if adjusting to the space itself, her hand brushing lightly against the surface of a nearby structure that pulsed in response to her touch, and for a moment her composure fractured just enough for him to see it, the strain beneath the control, the effort it was taking to remain exactly as she had been trained to be. "This is not your concern," she said, but the words lacked the finality they had carried before, and Daniel exhaled through his nose, steady, grounded, because he recognized that tone. He had heard it from people trying to maintain control in situations that were already slipping. "Everything in this room is my concern," he replied, "because I am still in it," and that earned him a reaction, not anger, not offense, but a pause, a brief interruption in her certainty that hung between them like a held breath. The system chimed again, sharper now, and Daniel noticed the delay this time, the fraction of a second between the temperature shift and the system response, a lag that should not have been there, and his focus narrowed, instincts aligning, because that delay meant one thing: the system was no longer keeping up. "It is falling behind," he said, almost to himself, but she heard it, of course she did, her eyes locking onto his with renewed intensity, and for the first time there was something in them that had not been there before, not command, not superiority, but the beginning of doubt. The air grew heavier, warmer, the light more saturated, and Daniel took a slow breath, grounding himself again, because whatever this night had been meant to do, it was not unfolding the way anyone expected, and he could feel it now, not just in the rising temperature or the shifting light, but in the space between them, something changing, something unpredictable. And for the first time since he stepped into that chamber, Daniel Hayes realized this might not be a test designed for him to fail, it might be a system already on the edge of breaking, and he was the only one in the room who had ever learned how to deal with something like that. The delay stretched again, longer this time, just enough for Daniel to feel it before he saw it, the temperature climbing without immediate correction, the light pulsing out of sync with the system's own rhythm, and he stepped closer to the nearest panel without thinking, drawn by instinct more than permission, his eyes scanning the alien interface for patterns he could translate into something useful, something human, because failure always left a signature no matter what language it spoke. Behind him, Lyra's breath caught, subtle but sharp, and when he turned his head slightly he saw it more clearly now, the glow beneath her skin no longer even, but flaring in uneven waves that followed no predictable cycle, like energy searching for a path it could not find, and the room responded in kind, overcorrecting, then hesitating, then trying again. "It is not designed for this level of variance," he said, voice steady but faster now, thinking out loud the way he always had when the situation turned critical, it is trying to stabilize you using baseline parameters, but you are not staying within them, and for a moment she did not answer, her focus turned inward, as if she was measuring something he could not see, something only she could feel. It has always been sufficient, she said finally, but the words sounded more like a memory than a certainty, and Daniel shook his head once, already moving, closing the distance to another panel, pressing his palm lightly against its surface as it reacted with a soft ripple of light, acknowledging contact even if it did not fully recognize his input. Sufficient does not mean adaptive, he replied, eyes narrowing as he traced the shifting symbols, watching how the system compensated, where it hesitated, where it failed to anticipate, and a familiar realization settled into place, quiet but undeniable. This was not a controlled environment anymore, it was a loop, a system feeding its own instability. Another chime sounded, sharper than before, followed by a brief drop in temperature that felt almost like relief before it surged again, stronger, and Lyra staggered a half step, catching herself with a hand against the structure beside her, her composure slipping further, not dramatically, but enough that the difference was unmistakable. Daniel turned fully then, his focus shifting from the panels to her, because no system mattered more than the person it was trying to sustain, and what he saw tightened something in his chest, not fear, not exactly, but urgency, the kind that did not wait for permission. You are not the problem, he said, voice firm, grounding, the system is, and her eyes snapped to his, something sharp flickering through them, resistance, disbelief, maybe even offense, but it did not hold, not completely, because the evidence was building all around them. You presume much for someone with no authority here, she said, though the edge in her tone had dulled, worn down by the effort it took to maintain it, and Daniel took one step closer, slow, deliberate, giving her space even as he entered it. Authority does not fix failing systems, he answered, understanding does, and for a second the room seemed to hold its breath with them, the light dimming just slightly as if the structure itself was listening. The next fluctuation came harder, the air thickening, warmer, the delay stretching too far now, the system clearly behind, and Daniel moved without hesitation, reaching out not to control, not to restrain, but to steady, his hand hovering just short of her arm, waiting for the smallest sign that she would reject it. She did not. The contact, when it came, was light, careful, nothing more than a point of grounding in a space that was losing all sense of balance, and he felt it immediately, the heat, the uneven rhythm beneath her skin, like standing near a system pushed past safe limits, and his instincts shifted again, recalibrating, not for danger, but for response. You need to sit, he said quietly, not as an order, but as a fact, one human to another, and she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the weight of everything she had been trained to be pressing against the simplicity of the suggestion, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she allowed it, her posture lowering just enough to signal something far more significant than the movement itself, and in that moment, as the system continued to struggle around them, Daniel understood that this night was no longer about what the room was meant to do to him, it was about whether he could keep it from failing her. The moment she lowered herself, the room reacted as if it had been waiting for that exact shift, the lights dimming just enough to reduce the strain while the temperature hesitated in its climb, buying a few seconds that felt longer than they should have, and Daniel adjusted with it, crouching slightly to stay level with her, not above, not imposing, just present, because presence had always mattered more than control in moments like this. His hand remained steady at her arm, not gripping. Just there, a constant point in a system that was anything but stable, and he could feel the uneven pulses beneath her skin, rising and falling in patterns that no longer aligned with the room's attempts to regulate them. Listen to me, he said quietly, voice low enough to cut through the ambient hum without adding to it. Your body is running ahead of the system, it is expecting responses that are not coming fast enough. And her eyes flickered toward him, focus sharpening for a brief second. As she tried to anchor herself to his words, her breath still uneven but no longer entirely uncontrolled, it has always adapted, she said, though there was less certainty now, more reliance on what had been rather than what was, and Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that without letting it define the present. Then something changed, he replied, and the system did not change with it, and that landed differently, not as contradiction, but as possibility, and he saw it register in the subtle shift of her expression, the smallest recalibration of belief. Another tone echoed through the chamber, softer this time, almost uncertain, and the temperature dipped again, briefly, like a system testing a correction before committing to it, and Daniel took that as confirmation. The feedback loop was still there, still responsive, just overwhelmed. "We can work with that," he murmured, more to himself now, his mind already mapping the adjustments, the timing, the rhythm, and he shifted his position slightly, angling himself so that he could see both her and the nearest panel without losing contact, without breaking the one stable point he had established. "You need to slow it down," he continued, bringing his attention back to her, because no system override would matter if the source remained unstable. Not force it, just give it something steady to follow. And she exhaled again, longer this time, the sound less strained, as if the idea itself provided a kind of structure she could align with. "You speak as if it will listen," she said, but the question had softened, edged now with something closer to hope than doubt, and Daniel allowed a faint smile to touch his expression. "Brief but real, everything listens," he said, "if you give it the right signal." And for a moment, the two of them existed in that narrow space between chaos and control, the room still shifting around them, still trying to catch up, but no longer completely out of sync. He adjusted his breathing then, deliberately, slow and even, a steady cadence he knew could influence more than just his own body, and after a second, he saw her begin to mirror it, not perfectly, not immediately, but enough that the pattern started to form, a shared rhythm cutting through the noise of the failing system. The lights responded first, stabilizing in a softer glow, then the temperature followed, no longer climbing in sharp increments but easing, gradually, like pressure being released in controlled steps, and Daniel kept his focus locked on her, not the panels, not the data, because this was where the real correction was happening. "That is it," he said quietly, reinforcing the shift. "Stay with that," and she did, her posture still tense but no longer rigid, her breathing aligning more consistently with his, the erratic pulses beneath her skin beginning to smooth into something the system could finally recognize. Something it could support instead of chase. Another chime sounded, but this time it was different, softer, almost like acknowledgement, and Daniel let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding, because for the first time since the door had closed behind him, the room did not feel like it was on the edge of breaking. Lyra's gaze remained on him, steady now in a way it had not been before, and there was something new in it, not authority, not assessment, but awareness, as if she was seeing him not as a variable in a system, but as the one thing in the room that had not failed her when everything else began to fall behind. The system settled into a fragile balance, not fully stable but no longer spiraling, the light in the chamber soft and even, the temperature holding within a range that felt intentional rather than reactive, and Daniel remained where he was, his breathing still slow, still steady, giving the room a rhythm it could follow without chasing. Lyra did not pull away from his touch, though her posture had regained some of its natural composure, the sharp precision of her presence returning in layers, rather than all at once, like a structure being rebuilt from the inside out. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy but measured, filled with the quiet hum of a system that had finally found something it could work with. Daniel glanced toward the nearest panel again, not out of urgency this time, but out of habit, noting how the fluctuations had smoothed into smaller, more predictable adjustments. The delay reduced to something manageable, and he nodded faintly to himself, confirming what he already felt. They had interrupted the loop, not by overpowering it, but by giving it a stable reference it could align with. "It is adapting now," he said quietly, more as an observation than a statement, and Lyra followed his gaze for a brief second before returning it to him, her expression no longer distant, no longer purely analytical, but something more complex, something that held a question she had not yet decided how to ask. "It has never required assistance before," she said slowly, each word chosen with care, as if she was stepping into unfamiliar territory and measuring the ground beneath her feet, and Daniel gave a small, almost thoughtful shrug, the tension easing from his shoulders now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Most systems do not," he replied, "until the moment they do," and that seemed to settle into the space between them, not as a challenge, but as a truth that neither of them could ignore. The glow beneath her skin had softened, the earlier intensity replaced by a more even, controlled pattern that matched the steady rise and fall of her breathing, and Daniel withdrew his hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to test whether the stability would hold without direct contact, And it did, the system maintaining its rhythm, her posture remaining steady, and he allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. Lyra noticed the shift immediately, her eyes tracking the movement with a focus that felt different now, less like evaluation and more like awareness, and for a brief second she reached out, not to stop him, but to mirror the motion, her fingers brushing lightly against his wrist before she let them fall back to her side, the contact fleeting but deliberate. "You altered the outcome," she said, her voice lower now, no longer carrying the same weight of command, but something more grounded, more personal, and Daniel shook his head once, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "No," he said, "you did," and that answer seemed to catch her off guard in a way nothing else had, her expression shifting again, not toward confusion, but toward something deeper, something that had not been part of the system she understood. The chamber responded to the sustained balance with a gradual dimming of its lights, the environment easing into a resting state, and Daniel took a slow step back, giving her space now that it was safe to do so, his posture relaxed but still attentive, because stability did not mean certainty, and he knew better than to assume the system would not fluctuate again. "This was not what was intended," she said after a moment, her gaze drifting briefly across the chamber as if seeing it differently now, not as a controlled environment, but as something that had failed to meet its purpose, and Daniel let out a quiet breath, the hint of a dry smile touching his expression. "No," he agreed, "it was not," and the simplicity of that exchange carried more weight than any explanation could have. Another soft tone echoed through the room, signaling the transition into a lower state of activity, and the air cooled slightly, settling into something that felt almost normal, almost human, and for the first time since he had entered the chamber, Daniel realized he was no longer waiting for the moment things would go wrong. Lyra turned her attention back to him fully then, her posture straightening, her presence returning in full, but not unchanged, not untouched by what had just happened, and when she spoke again, there was no command in her voice, no expectation, just a quiet acknowledgement that seemed to redefine everything that had come before it. "You remained," she said, as if that single fact held more significance than anything else in the night, and Daniel met her gaze with the same steady calm he had carried from the beginning. "Yeah," he answered simply, "I did," and in the silence that followed, the room no longer felt like a place designed to break him, it felt like a place where something else had been tested instead, something neither of them had fully understood until now. The chamber remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of expectation, it was the silence of something recalibrating, systems easing into a new equilibrium that had not been part of their original design, and Daniel stood there for a moment longer, letting his senses adjust, letting his instincts confirm what his eyes already told him. The crisis had passed, at least for now. The air felt cooler against his skin, the faint metallic scent fading into something cleaner, more neutral, and the light above shifted into a steady, low glow that cast long, soft shadows across the curved architecture of the room. Lyra moved first, not abruptly, not with the sharp authority she had carried before, but with measured intent, rising to her full height with a composure that had returned, though not untouched. Her movement still precise but now carrying the subtle awareness of someone who had just experienced something outside her control. Daniel stepped back fully then, giving her the space she had reclaimed, his posture relaxed but attentive, the way it always was after the immediate danger passed but before the situation was fully understood. "Your system will continue to adjust," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational now, as if they were discussing a piece of equipment instead of what had just unfolded between them. "But it is going to need time to settle into this new pattern," and she regarded him in silence for a moment, her gaze steady, not distant, not guarded, just present, as if she was weighing not just his words, but the way he had said them, the lack of fear, the absence of expectation. "You speak as though you have done this many times," she said, and there was something in her tone now that had not been there before, not authority, not skepticism, but curiosity, genuine and unfiltered. And Daniel let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Not like this," he admitted, "but people, systems, they all break the same way, and they all recover the same way too, if you give them the chance." And she held his gaze for a second longer, as if searching for something beneath the surface of that answer, something that explained why he had chosen to stay, why he had not taken advantage of the situation when the balance had tipped so far in his favor. The chamber responded again with a soft tone, different from the earlier alerts, more structured, more formal, and Daniel glanced briefly toward the sealed door as a faint line of light appeared along its edge, signaling a change in status, a transition that had likely been scheduled long before either of them entered the room. Lyra followed his gaze, then returned her attention to him, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet weight, not imposed, but earned. "They will expect a result," she said, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact, and Daniel nodded once, because that part had never been unclear. The entire night had been built around expectation, outcome, purpose. "Yeah," he said, simple, grounded. "They probably will," and for a moment, the space between them held that reality, the outside world pressing gently against the controlled environment they had just stabilized, reminding them that whatever had changed here would not remain contained. Lyra took a slow step forward, closing part of the distance he had created, not to reclaim dominance, but to stand within the same space again, her presence no longer overwhelming, but aligned, and when she stopped, her eyes met his with a clarity that felt new, unfiltered by protocol or assumption. "What happened here?" she said quietly, "was not the outcome they intended," and Daniel met her gaze without hesitation, the steady calm that had carried him through the night still there, unchanged. "No," he replied, "but it worked," and something in that answer seemed to settle into her, not as defiance, but as recognition, and she gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging a truth she could not deny. The door behind him released a soft hiss, the seal disengaging with a controlled precision that contrasted sharply with the instability that had filled the room earlier, and the line of light widened into a narrow opening, the outside corridor waiting, silent and expectant, just as it had been before. Daniel did not move immediately, did not step toward it, because for the first time since he had been brought here, the choice felt like it was his, not imposed, not dictated, and he glanced back at her, just once, a silent question in the motion, not about permission, but about understanding. Lyra held his gaze, and for a brief moment, the Empress was not a figure of power, not a symbol of authority, but simply someone who had shared a moment of uncertainty and chosen not to let it define the outcome. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, but softer than before, carrying a weight that did not come from command. "They expected you to fail," she said, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of a tired smile crossing his face. "Yeah," he answered, "I figured," and then, after a beat, he added, quieter, almost to himself, "Good thing they were wrong," and in the quiet that followed, as the door waited open and the system behind them continued to hold its new balance, it was no longer clear who had been tested that night, or which of them had truly changed because of it. The corridor beyond the door did not move, did not breathe the way the chamber had, but it carried a different kind of weight, one built from expectation rather than pressure, and Daniel stepped through it slowly, his boots making a muted sound against the polished surface as the door sealed behind him with a soft finality that marked the end of something neither side had planned for. The guards were still there, exactly where they had been before, but their posture had shifted, not visibly enough for most to notice, yet Daniel caught it immediately, the slight hesitation, the subtle recalibration in how they regarded him, as if the outcome they had anticipated had not arrived, and now they were left adjusting to a result they did not fully understand. He did not speak, did not offer explanation, because none had been asked, and explanations had a way of complicating things that were already difficult enough to process, so he walked forward, steady, grounded, letting them fall into step behind him without command. The air in the corridor felt cooler than before, or maybe he was just more aware of it now, his senses still tuned from the chamber, still measuring, still comparing, and somewhere behind that awareness, a quieter realization settled in. The night had not ended when the door opened, it had only shifted into something else. At the far end of the hall, a set of larger doors parted before he reached them, revealing a wide chamber filled with figures arranged in precise formation, their presence controlled, their expressions unreadable, but their attention unmistakably fixed on him, and Daniel slowed his pace just enough to take it in, not as a threat, but as a situation, one more environment to read, one more system to understand. He could feel the weight of their expectations, not directed at him personally, but at the role he had been placed into, the outcome they had already decided before he ever stepped into that first room. And for a brief second he considered how easily he could have met those expectations by doing nothing at all, by letting the system run its course the way it was designed, by becoming exactly what they had assumed he would be. but that was not what had happened, and now he stood at the edge of something none of them had prepared for. A figure stepped forward from the formation, taller than the others, draped in layered fabrics that shimmered under the ambient light, and though no words were spoken, the shift in the room made it clear. This was someone who mattered, someone who had authority in a place where authority defined everything. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but steady, his gaze level, because whatever this moment was supposed to be, he was not going to step into it as something less than himself. The silence stretched just long enough to become intentional, and then the figure inclined their head slightly, a gesture that carried more weight than any spoken acknowledgement, and Daniel understood, without needing translation, that they were waiting, not for a report, not for details, but for confirmation, for proof that the outcome had aligned with their design. He did not give it to them. Instead, he simply stood there, the quiet of the chamber settling around him, his presence alone the answer they were not expecting, and in that stillness, something shifted again, not in the air, not in the light, but in the understanding of everyone watching. The system they had built, the outcome they had predicted, had not failed completely, but it had not succeeded either, and the difference between those two things was standing right in front of them. Behind him, the sealed door remained silent, but Daniel knew what was on the other side of it, not just the chamber, not just the system, but the person who had stepped outside of it for the first time, and he felt that knowledge settle into him with a quiet certainty. He had not walked out because he was stronger, or smarter, or more prepared than anyone before him. He had walked out because he had chosen not to follow the path that had been set for him. The figure in front of him studied him for another moment, longer this time, as if searching for something that would make sense of the outcome, and when they finally spoke, their voice carried a controlled neutrality that could not quite hide the shift beneath it. The chamber has completed its cycle, they said, the words precise, measured, and Daniel nodded once, because that part was true, even if it was not the whole truth. Yeah, he replied, his voice calm, steady. It did, and he did not elaborate, did not add anything more, because the rest of the answer was not something he was going to give them, not yet, maybe not ever. And in the quiet that followed, the realization began to spread through the room, subtle at first, then undeniable. Whatever had happened inside that chamber had not just changed the outcome of a single night, it had changed the way they would have to understand what came next. No one moved to stop him, but no one looked away either, and that was the first sign that something had shifted deeper than protocol, deeper than expectation, because in a room built on certainty, hesitation did not belong. The figure at the front remained still, their gaze fixed on Daniel as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality, the one they had prepared for and the one now standing in front of them. And for a long second the silence held, stretched thin across the chamber like a surface that could break if pressed too hard. Then, behind him, the sealed door released another soft hiss. The sound was quiet, controlled, but it cut through the stillness with a precision that redirected every eye in the room, not to Daniel, but to what followed him. The opening widened slowly, light from the chamber beyond spilling into the hall in a softer tone than before, no longer harsh, no longer unstable, and then she stepped through. Lyra Vera did not rush, did not hesitate, her movement measured, deliberate, each step carrying the same composure she had held before the night began, but there was something different now, something no system had accounted for, something that did not come from power or design. The room felt it immediately. Daniel did not turn right away, but he did not need to. He could feel the shift behind him the same way he had felt the imbalance earlier, only now it was not pressure, it was alignment, a presence that no longer strained against the space around it. When he did glance back, just briefly, he saw it clearly, the glow beneath her skin steady, controlled, no longer flaring in uneven waves, and more than that, her expression, not distant, not calculating, but aware, present in a way that made the room seem smaller around her. She walked past him without breaking stride, her shoulder aligning with his for the smallest fraction of a second, and in that moment there was no signal, no command, just a quiet acknowledgement that needed no translation. The figure at the front straightened slightly, not in challenge, but in recognition of something that had not been anticipated, and when Lyra stopped a few feet ahead of Daniel, facing the assembled council, the shift became undeniable. The cycle is complete, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, controlled as always, but no longer confined to the narrow definition they had built for it, and the words landed with precision, but not with the meaning they expected. A subtle ripple moved through the formation, not disorder, not confusion, but recalibration, as if each of them was adjusting to a variable that had just been introduced into a system they believed was closed. The lead figure stepped forward again, their posture more rigid now, their tone measured but edged with something that had not been there before, and the result? They asked, and the question hung in the air, not directed at Daniel this time, but at her. Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her head slightly, just enough to look back toward him, not seeking approval, not asking permission, but acknowledging the presence that had altered the outcome in a way no one in the room could ignore. Daniel held her gaze for a second, steady, unchanged, offering nothing more than what he had already given, and then she faced forward again. The result, she said, her voice even, unwavering, is not what you intended, and the statement did not carry defiance, it carried truth, and that made it heavier than any challenge. The silence that followed was deeper than before, no longer uncertain, but significant. And Daniel could feel it settle across the room, the weight of realization spreading through a structure that had always relied on predictability. He shifted his stance slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just grounding himself in the moment, because whatever came next was not going to follow the path they had planned, and for the first time since he had been brought here, that uncertainty did not feel like a threat, it felt like space. Behind him, the chamber remained quiet, stable, holding the balance they had created within it, and ahead, the room of observers stood at the edge of something they could not yet define, and in that space between design and outcome, Daniel Hayes remained exactly where he had chosen to be, not as a variable, not as a subject, but as the reason the system had not broken when it was supposed to. The silence did not break, it transformed, settling into something heavier than uncertainty, something closer to recognition, and Daniel felt it in the way no one interrupted her, in the way the room held its breath not out of doubt, but because the truth she had spoken did not fit anywhere inside the structure they had built. The lead figure remained still, their gaze shifting between Lyra and Daniel, recalculating, adjusting, as if searching for a response that would restore the balance they had always relied on, but no such response came, and that absence carried its own meaning. Lyra did not step back, did not soften her stance, but she did not advance either. She simply stood there, present in a way that required no reinforcement, and after a moment, she spoke again, her voice steady, unforced. The system performed within its design, she said, and a subtle tension moved through the chamber at the phrasing, because it was precise, accurate, and incomplete all at once, but the design was insufficient, and that landed differently, not as accusation, but as conclusion, the kind that could not be dismissed without confronting the flaw it revealed. Daniel remained where he was, just behind her, not hidden, not elevated, simply part of the outcome now. And he watched the reaction ripple through the gathered figures, controlled, contained, but real, because systems built on certainty did not fail gracefully. They adjusted slowly, reluctantly, and only when there was no other option. The lead figure finally took another step forward, the movement deliberate, measured, their voice returning with a controlled neutrality that had regained some of its edge. You imply a deviation, they said, and Lyra inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. There was no deviation, she replied, only a variable that was not accounted for, and the weight of that statement shifted again, because it did not challenge their authority, it expanded the scope of what they had to consider. The figure's gaze turned fully to Daniel then, assessing, not as a subject, not as a failure, but as something undefined, something that did not fit into the parameters they understood, and Daniel met that gaze without resistance, without offering anything more than what was already evident, because he knew better. Then to try to explain something they had to see for themselves. Another silence followed, shorter this time, more focused, and then the figure spoke again, quieter, but more deliberate. And this variable, they said, what is its function? And for the first time, the question was not directed at a system, or a process, but at a person. Daniel exhaled slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, because he had already answered that question without words, and he did not intend to complicate it now. I do not have one, he said, his voice calm, grounded. I just stayed, and the simplicity of that answer carried through the chamber in a way no technical explanation could have, because it did not describe a function, it described a choice. Lyra's gaze shifted back to him for a brief moment, not in surprise, but in confirmation, as if the answer aligned with something she had already understood, and when she faced forward again, her voice carried a quiet finality that settled over the room like a boundary being drawn. That, she said, is why the system did not fail, and no one spoke after that, not immediately, because the implication was too clear, too complete to be dismissed. Without unraveling the structure they depended on, the chamber lights dimmed slightly, not as a reaction, but as part of a natural cycle returning to baseline, and Daniel felt the shift in the air, the subtle easing of tension as the system around them adjusted to a new equilibrium, one that included something it had never accounted for before. The lead figure held their position for a moment longer, then inclined their head, a gesture small enough to be missed, but significant enough to mark the end of the exchange, and the formation behind them followed suit, not in unison, but in sequence, each movement acknowledging a change that could not be undone. Daniel did not move right away, did not step forward or back, because for the first time since he had been brought here, there was no immediate direction to follow, no expectation to meet, just a quiet space where something new had taken hold. Beside him, Lyra remained still, her presence steady, no longer defined by the system that had failed to contain her, and for a brief second, she turned her head just enough that he could see the faint reflection of the chamber lights in her eyes, steady, human in a way that had nothing to do with biology. They will study this, she said quietly, not as a warning, but as an inevitability, and Daniel let out a soft breath, the hint of a smile returning, not because it was amusing, but because it was familiar. Yeah, he said, they always do, and then, after a pause, he added, just loud enough for her to hear, they just will not understand it the same way. And in the stillness that followed, as the chamber settled into its new balance and the people within it adjusted to a reality they had not designed, the night did not end with a command or a conclusion, it ended with something quieter, something that lingered longer than any system ever could, the simple truth that he had not been a solution, or a failure, or even a variable. He had just been human, and for once, that had been enough.